Hello, everybody. My name is Gilda Ross. I'm the Glenbard Student and Community Projects Coordinator. Very, very excited that you could join us. I know there are watch parties that are happening throughout the county for this very special event with Dr. Sarah Vinson, a very busy psychiatrist who I'm truly honored that she made time for the GPS Parent Series today. Thank you to all of you who have given us the gift of your time. Our ask of you is to please share this resource. We are on at noon, we are on at 7, we are in 4 different languages, and everybody's welcome here. Find the website, find your link, and join us. So thank you for that. We're grateful to the sponsors who make this all possible. And again, the gift of your time means so much. I quickly want to tell you about upcoming events before we begin this event. So next week we are hosting Dr. Alexandra Solomon. She will be in person at the College of DuPage at noon in the Culinary Arts Building, and then it will be a Zoom event and also a Zoom at noon as well. She'll be talking about her book, Love Every Day, about how to cultivate healthy relationships for joy, peace, and a meaningful life. Following March 12th, we're going to be hosting Brian Perlman. This is a good time for today's talk and a good time for this talk as well. Some of the struggles that people are feeling now, how can we set goals so that we can be our best self? That's on the 19th at noon and 7 p.m. And then we're going to conclude the month. Mary Ann Little has a book called Childhood Narcissism: How Not to Raise a Childhood in an All, How Not to Raise a Narcissist in an All About Me World. That's on March 25th at noon and 7 p.m. April Megan Leahy of the Washington Post will be here to talk about her book on April 10th, Parenting Outside the Lines, Following Your Own Tuition. So please go to the website, find the programs that speak to you, and share the resource, and organize watch parties like so many people have done this morning. It is my honor, my true honor, to also introduce our introducer. That is my friend, Dr. James Shannon. He is a Reverend Dr. James Shannon, pastor of People's Community Church and a distinguished board member of the District 87 School Board. So, Dr. Shannon, please take it away.
Thank you, Gilda, and thank you for this great event that we are about to have. Our speaker is a celebrated physician who specialized in adult, child, and adolescent forensic psychiatry and psychopharmacology. Now, let me pause for a minute because this psychopharmacology is a scientific study of the effects of drugs on the mind and on our behavior. And young people, this is something that we really need to think about. This psychopharmacology is really something to think about if we're going to ever experiment with drugs or alcohol. So I got plenty of questions for our speaker on that. Our speaker is a professor and chair of the psychiatry and pediatrics at Morehouse College of Medicine and an adjunct faculty member at Emory University School of Medicine. She has served on many national and statewide professional organizations, and she is an advisor for the Judges Psychiatry Initiative. Our speaker has received the following awards. Number one, University of Florida College of Medicine Outstanding Young Alumnus Award. Number two, the American Psychiatry Association Gene Spurlock Fellowship Alumni Achievements Award. We are very proud today and delighted to welcome Dr. Sarah Vinson to speak to GPS today. Take it away, Dr. Vinson.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for having me. And I always like to leave time for discussion. I believe that there is always collective wisdom in groups, and I learn a lot from discussion and questions have a way of helping us know what's relevant to the audience too. So we will get through this and then we'll chat. So this is a facilitated discussion, is what I'm going to call it, about youth mental health. And this is informed by my work, providing care to children and to families, but also based in my work as an academic, co-editor of the book Social Injustice and Mental Health, and someone who's at that forensic mental health and court system interface as well. So I think it's always helpful to start with what is mental health. And I understand that this is a series where you talk about mental health all the time, but I'll tell you, I did 6 years of training after medical school in places that are, some of the biggest brands in the world. And we don't spend a lot of time actually talking about health. We talk about illness, we talk about disease, we talk about disorders, we talk about interventions, but we don't talk about health nearly as much as we should. The World Health Organization has this definition I really like that says mental health is a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to her or his community. And I welcome you to reflect on what is in that definition and what is not in that definition, right? A lot of times when we talk about mental health, it's do they have a diagnosis or not? Are they in therapy or not? Is there a problem or not, right? Are they taking their medications or not? None of that is in this definition, right? This definition is about relationship. It's about purpose. It's about coping. It's about the continuum of stresses. It's about what's going on in your community, and does it even give you the opportunities to achieve these different aspects of mental health? And so sometimes under the medical model, under the mental health model in the US, things are so individualistically framed, right? But if you look at this definition of mental health, it's very hard to achieve without a community, without an environment, without social drivers that support you being able to be healthy. So it's really not this individual thing, right? It happens in concert with community. And so here's my take. In most cases, things are written with adults in mind, which is adultism, and we'll talk more about that as the talk goes on. So here's my extrapolation from that definition of what that could look like for teenagers or for children. Able to develop healthy and emotional, intellectual, and social functioning, because of course they're learning those things. Able to explore, practice, and implement a growing repertoire of adaptive skills for identifying and handling difficult emotions and stressful situations, right? So just that task of learning language for what you're experiencing, knowing what it is. And we all adapt, we all cope. It's a matter of whether we're doing that in a way that is helpful to us. Able to advance academically and occupationally to the best of their ability, able to play a positive, developmentally appropriate role in their families and communities. And so everyone on this Zoom, everyone in your family, even the people who are taking care of you, who may be in roles like mine as a psychiatrist or a therapist, is on this continuum between mental health and mental illness. And everyone, depending on what they're going through in life, what vulnerabilities they brought into the world as young people or as infants or based on their family history, can go up or down on this continuum. And what we saw with COVID, right, is this mass experiment of people having more risk factors and more stressors, and them having more constrictions around what they could do when it came to adaptive coping. And not surprisingly, we saw population mental health numbers go toward more people having illness. All of those people didn't change overnight, right? Their DNA didn't change overnight. What happened was this balance was thrown off in a really major way. But it's important to keep in mind that the diagnostic criteria, diagnoses, they serve some purposes, right? But they only go so far, because you can have people who may not meet all the criteria, but who still may be inching toward illness, or that still may be coping in maladaptive ways that don't quite fit some of the language we have in the mental health field. Even before COVID happened, there was talk, discussion, concern about the state of youth mental health. And there were words being thrown around like crisis even before. So the mental health issues were the leading cause of disability and poor health outcomes in youth. 1 in 5 in the US were impacted. Of the 7.7 with mental illness, about 1/2 did not receive treatment. And between 2007 and 2018, suicide rates among youth ages 10 to 24 in the US had increased by 57%. Also before COVID, there were reports of sadness or hopelessness that were increasing. Seriously considering attempting suicide had increased by 36%, as had creating a suicide plan had also increased that by a number of 44%. And before COVID, we were seeing this show up in the psychiatric emergency rooms or in the regular ERs, but it's psychiatric visits. So from 2011 and 2015, we saw that youth psychiatric visits to emergency departments for depression, anxiety, and behavioral challenges increased by 28%. And going back to that uh, that visual, right, of the continuum of people being pushed towards illness or pushed toward health, if you're part of a marginalized community, right, there are going to be more chronic stressors that are always part of the background. So when you looked at these numbers before COVID, and I'm going to use marginalization by race and marginalization by socioeconomic status as two examples, the numbers were concerning overall, but when you looked at people who are also dealing with racism or with poverty, those numbers were even more alarming and the trends were more pronounced. So since COVID, right, we know that that was a collective trauma. We know that there were lots of things that were disrupted as a result of it. And then also the very practical impact of grief and loss for people who lost people due to COVID. We have seen that those trends we saw before have accelerated in some ways and did in the immediate aftermath of it. So emergency department visits in the US for suspected suicide attempts were 51% higher for adolescent girls and 4% higher for adolescent boys compared to the same time period in early 2019. In the CDC's first nationally representative survey of high school students during the pandemic, they found that 25% reported seriously contemplating suicide, 37% reported experiencing poor mental health, 40% reported feeling persistently sad or hopeless, and 55% reported experiencing emotional abuse at home during the pandemic. So when we go back to that definition of mental health, just think about how many youth have been exposed to these things during a really critical developmental age that could have the ability to impair somebody's to attain that ideal. The other thing that I want to point out about this study is that this is high school students. So when you have studies of kids in school, you're actually going to miss the ones who are the highest risk groups, the ones who are in juvenile justice, maybe in child welfare and in between schools, or who have been expelled or are no longer in the school system. So this doesn't even capture the most vulnerable youth in society. So when we're considering youth mental health, right, this is a stressful time in our country. It's a highly polarized time in our country for adults who have some perspective and are able to take a longer view of things. You can imagine what it's like for someone who is young, who's just making decisions about college when NIH funding is being cut and things like that, and what it must be for them. And so sometimes with our language, we use the word anxiety when there is really fact-based, reality-based stress and fear that people are experiencing. And depending on where you are in various forms of identity or various social hierarchies, that fear may be more relevant to you or for your family. And when we consider things like race, right, that are not able to be changed, that you can't work your way out of or will your way out of, there's a way that that stress is just part of your experience of being in this country. And so one of the things that is helpful to keep in mind, right, is that it feels like a lot because it is. And sometimes distress is characterized as anxiety or a disorder, but sometimes it's a response that makes sense given what is actually going on. So we are thinking more as a society about marginalization, about different isms like racism, ableism, sexism, colorism, nativism, right? We're thinking about how this plays into people's experiences going through society. But I would argue that the one that has one of the largest, if not the largest, negative effect on population mental health is actually adultism. And I'm going to have the voice of some children to contribute. Hopefully, this will play.
can tell when somebody's not listening to me when they don't look at me in the eye or they just start saying about a whole new other topic or something like that.
An adult is not supporting me when they look like they aren't paying attention, they look like they don't care, or it just looks like they're not really worried or concerned.
I can tell when they're not paying attention to me when they're looking at somebody else or they're on their phone and I can like see it.
I could tell when somebody's not listening to me or things of that nature when they kind of like they'll cut me off or they'll try to finish my sentence for me, assume what I'm saying.
I can tell an adult is not necessarily listening to me when they aren't grasping the idea of what I'm saying and they're just agreeing on what they're going like, yeah, I get what you're saying. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Then it's like, are you really listening or are you just nodding your head so I can, speak less?
You can just tell when you try to put some input in, but they kind of just ignore it and just keep on going with what they were doing or just not really looking at you.
So I think they should like make more eye contact. That's way better than nothing at all because a lot of kids cry more often when they don't and they feel way more lonely. And when you feel lonely, like you're not in a good mood.
When adults don't listen to me, I feel kind of lonely and it feels like no one is like listening to me and no one understands what I'm talking about.
I don't really feel like adults listen to kids because they have the mindset that, oh, they're older, so they're more superior. So what they say goes, and what we say, it doesn't matter. Kids are definitely not heard most of the time, but sometimes, in school, out of school, they definitely are. Like, I mean, right now, yeah.
Adults do tend to listen to younger people sometimes, but it's not all the time because they think that younger people don't really know as much as older people. So they tend to think that they know a lot more than any young person does, and they're not going to listen to them.
I think sometimes adults have a habit of thinking that because they have the experience and the age that they know what's best sometimes. But really, I think the kid is who is experiencing all of this. And so I think they should have more of a say.
Started to notice that difference actually when I was in pre-K and they were spelling out words and I knew what they were spelling out and they were just doing it so they could go above our heads like we weren't able to be talked to. So starting there and up to elementary school, middle school, and even high school, I started noticing those kind of small differences.
I can tell when an adult doesn't really respect me or other kids when they seem to just pass it off that it's just some kind of phase they're going through or just, oh, they're just like this just because they want attention, which usually is the case because kids need attention. That's just something they need.
I think people don't listen to kids sometimes because it's like they view you as like irresponsible or like you're gonna get hurt or something.
You should at least have a little bit respect for me, myself as a younger person, than to talk down to me or belittle me like I am, like I don't know anything.
That makes me feel kind of less than and not respected as a human being that's not equal to someone who's even 5 or 10 years older than me, and not like a fully person.
It kind of undermines you. It kind of makes you feel like a child again, like you don't have any real validation there, but you got to remind yourself that you do, that you are of an age where you can think for yourself and speak for yourself. So kind of tricky situation.
Like we have all this stuff going on outside of home, like, with our friends and at school and stuff. And like there's things that affect our mental state. And I think that a lot of times adults don't think about that. They're just thinking about what they see. So they're like, oh, I see this and this happening to them. They should be acting this way, but they don't know about all the things that are happening that they're not seeing. And that is also affecting how we might be acting.
Teenagers go through things they think they're joking, and sometimes they don't be joking. So all I just want to say is just, pay more attention. Tend to them, because if you don't tend to them, they'll go try to find something else to make up for that. And then, that kid won't be a kid no more.
kid is kind of just alone with their own thoughts and they don't know what to do and they can get very angry, very sad, and they could like run away or do something extreme.
When they don't respect you, it feels like all that effort you're putting in is nothing. It doesn't matter. All that hard work, all those hours you put into that class don't matter anymore. You don't matter. That's just kind of what it feels like. And it hurts sometimes. It gets you mad.
It's invalidating when people don't listen to me because I want to be taken seriously as a student and people don't. They just ignore me most of the time. And it's angering. It makes me not want to perform well in my classes and not care.
When I don't feel respected, it makes me very angry inside. Like it builds up so much anger, and then it'll make me want to spaz out. Like if I get too angry, I can black out, and I don't want to black out because I don't know what's going to happen. You want me to show respect to you, then I believe I should be getting respect back. That's how I feel.
The respect needs to be earned. I don't like when people tell me to respect someone simply because they're older than me when they're not being respectful to me. Especially the whole respect your elders thing or respect them because they're in authority when they're just not being respectful to me in any way.
If you're a mom or a dad, you need to be respected because you gave birth to that child. So therefore they need to respect you. But as like me to you, I should give you respect. Just because you're an adult and you're older than me, I don't know you. But I still gonna give you my respect because that's how I was raised.
That whole like moody teenager trope or the whole ungrateful teenager trope, I don't think it really exists because we're all very grateful at our core. Well, most of us. We just need to be given space to grow. Nothing that is caged in will ever learn how to fly.
Like, I love America. I was born here, but I feel like they need to make a stand to listen to us. Like, there could be a lot of kids discussing how they feel about school shootings, about racism, but they're not being heard.
Like, I think they're missing the bigger picture of it all. They aren't really like, they won't know a lot. And when it finally happens, it's like, oh, I didn't know. Well, told you.
Maybe I'm not as wise as you, but I still do have an opinion. So knowing that I do have an opinion, I want to be heard and be listened to and not my opinion to be shot down because of my age or because you don't want to do your job today. So just really understanding me.
A child, if they have something on their mind, I feel like they should speak it, and an adult, in an appropriate and responsive manner, they should say something. And it goes both ways. If an adult is unhappy with something that a child did, they should say it. And, you know, a child can understand that.
The adult in the situation, if a kid feels like they're being disrespected by them, they should ask, how can I help you, not feel disrespected? Like, what am I doing that kind of puts you off? So it's all situational. All people are different. You kind of just have to get to know a person to really understand them.
When somebody respects me, I feel like we have an understanding between the situation. I feel as if you get what I'm saying, I get what you're saying. There won't be any argument. There'll just be this calm conversation. I can tell someone cares when they ask questions and they seem intrigued, but like they just take it in, walk off with it. At least you listen.
Try to be more just friends. Like, just try to talk to them like a person.
Well, to me, a small thing is a very big thing. I can tell an adult is listening when they actually show that they're caring and when they look like they really are paying attention and like they really want to help and support you. So that makes me feel happy. That makes me feel like that person cares.
Kids from different social, ethnic, class backgrounds. They each have their own story. And regardless of all these differences, most of them just want adults who will listen to them and will be respectful of, what they want in life.
I feel like it can help with like anger and sadness, like not going out of control and going to heights that they don't need to be going to if you can just sit down and listen to what your kid is saying. Maybe what they have to say isn't always like important. Maybe it's like something random that they learned about at school, but they still want you to hear it.
That's put together by an advocacy group in Georgia called Georgia Voices for Children. And there's what they're talking about, right? The interpersonal adultism when youth voices are dismissed. But there's also the way that as a society, right, sometimes we're not listening to what the youth are telling us and to what the statistics about them are telling us about how we are not meeting their needs. So then that gets into structural adultism. And what is that? So this is the normalization and legitimization of historical, cultural, institutional, and interpersonal dynamics that routinely advantage adults while producing cumulative and chronic adverse outcomes for young people. So we know that early years really matter in terms of how people see themselves, how they see the world, their risk for not only mental health problems, but also physical health problems. And so the more adverse childhood experiences people have, the higher their risk throughout their lifetime of mental health issues. And so part of why I make this argument that this adultism issue is so important and overlooked is because when you have children, when you have youth who are facing these cumulative chronic adverse outcomes in these disproportionate ways, that's not positioning our society to be healthy in the long run. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip that one, but go into this slide that just illustrates some of what I'm talking about structurally. How is society investing in youth and families, and how does that show up? So if we look at the child poverty rate, it's 4.2 times higher than the national rate, with 1 out of 6 US children living in poverty. Considering abuse, girls 16 to 19 are 4 times more likely than the general population to be victims of rape, attempted rape, or sexual assault. Medicaid, we know, is a major player in youth health, more so than it is for adult health. And we are hearing, right, that Medicaid may be at risk in a way that is unique in the healthcare space currently. But even before whatever cuts may come, Medicaid fee-for-service physician service payment rates are nearly 30% below that for Medicare. Public education, between 2008 to 2018, students across the US lost nearly $600 billion in state's public school funding. And homelessness, an estimated 1 in 41 school-age children, with that number rising to 1 in 18 for children under age 6. And something as simple as childcare, which if any of you are parents, you know this quite well. I'm just the auntie, so I haven't felt this personally. But when you look at this chart, right, and you compare us to our peers national across the world, how much the US spends on childcare for toddlers, annual public spending, we are way, way at the bottom with a bar that's barely a bar compared to what other countries are doing. So when we go back to that definition of mental health, we think about how relationship based it is, right? We think about what it takes to protect children and to put them in safe, nurturing environments. It's really helpful, right, to have what you need in order for that to be financially feasible and accessible for people. And over the last decade, family childcare costs have increased 28%, and we most certainly have not seen wages increase to that degree. So John Rawls has this definition of social justice: assuring the protection of equal access to liberties, rights, and opportunities, as well as taking care of the least advantaged members of society. And so the way that I think about it, any discussion about youth health or youth mental health is a social justice discussion, because they very solidly fall in that least advantaged members of society camp. I will, for the sake of time, just talk a little bit about some of the disorders you might hear quite a bit about, right? All that fidgets isn't ADHD, all that worries isn't anxiety, and all that rebels isn't ODD. There are all kinds of reasons that kids may have trouble sitting still, that they may be hyperactive, that they may seem impulsive. And ADHD can be one of those reasons, but so can trauma, so can lead poisoning, so can being in an environment where they don't get the sleep that they need at night. And so there are ways that sometimes things are pathologized that are actually, in some cases, adaptive responses to what is happening in that child's environment. But what we see, right, are the symptoms, and the way that we're conditioned to think about things is that this child isn't doing what the adult expects them to be doing, when there may be other explanations. I had the chance to talk to one of your local radio hosts earlier this week, and it was brief, but I thought she did a great job of us getting some information out. But one of the points that I think is really important to hold, especially in this environment we're in now, is that there's a difference between fear, stress, and anxiety. And sometimes we label anything that feels uncomfortable as anxiety. And with anxiety, we're really talking about a diagnosis. We're talking about somebody who is taking something out of context, something that is a mental health condition. Stress is just part of life, right? You're going to have new challenges. You're going to have things that you have to figure out how to wrap your head around. You're going to have things that overwhelm your coping skills, but that's not necessarily pathological. It's not a diagnosis. That is part of navigating the world. And how you navigate that is a barometer of where you fall on that health continuum. But stress is normal and to be expected. Whereas fear, right, is a response that is actually related to real threats in your world, right? So when I am taking care of people who live in neighborhoods where they're not safe, they're literally not safe. We're not just talking about an anxiety disorder, right? We're talking about reality-based fear. And part of the treatment, part of the discussion, part of the intervention is acknowledging and understanding and naming that, and to the degree that you can, putting people or helping people get to safer situations. And all that rebels is not oppositional defiant disorder. So we have this diagnosis that we kind of throw at kids who aren't doing what the adults expect them to do. And the way that the diagnostic criteria is written, it doesn't say it, but if you read the criteria, it clearly is presuming that the adult is reasonable, consistent, and has that child's best interest at heart. And you all just saw that statistic about the risk faced by girls of sexual victimization. The frank reality is that many children have had experiences with adults where they have not been consistent or trustworthy or acted in their best interest. And sometimes the adults in their lives don't know that, and they're seeing the result of those traumatic experiences and how those children react with or interact with other adults. So ODD can be a manifestation of trauma. It may be unaddressed ADHD or mood symptoms, because with ADHD, sometimes people will say they're not listening. Well, they didn't hear you comprehend and store the instruction. It's not a willful thing. And when kids are depressed, they may be more withdrawn and just not have the energy or the motivation to do what people are asking of them. So the question is it adaptive? Is it something that has been modeled, or is it something that's reinforced in the family unit? When it comes to anxiety, is it fear? Is it appropriate stress? And are there things that have been modeled to them? Sometimes I think, especially when it comes to teenagers, families may start to underestimate how powerful your example still is. So how you are coping, how you are handling things, how you are catastrophizing, all can be things that they pick up on and start to do themselves. And with ADHD, right, sometimes it's a matter of them not having appropriate educational accommodations, them having undiagnosed, unidentified learning issues that are keeping them from being able to follow the material. And in the communities where I work that are dealing with more stressors, be that poverty, community violence, often I'll see people come in with questions about ADHD, but it really is stress and anxiety because they're preoccupied by these thoughts or by even trauma symptoms related to flashbacks of things that they've been exposed to, and possibly the onset of depression. When it comes to major depressive disorder, in this time, it's always important to differentiate between sadness and grief, right? They're still developing language for how they're feeling. And sadness, just like stress, is a normal part of life. The question is this something that is going on, that is taking up most of their day, that is going on for weeks at a time, and that is actually getting in the way of how they operate? Now, if you have a high achieving youth, sometimes grades or their work may be the last thing to go because that's such a big part of their identity. And so I'm going to skip to generalized anxiety disorder. And when you're thinking about anxiety versus stress and fear, right, are there things that are being distorted? Are there things that are taken out of context? Are they overestimating the likelihood of a bad outcome? And again, it's not just that you feel something that is unpleasant, but it's actually getting in the way. It's causing you to avoid your friends, not to turn in that homework, not to be able to sleep at night, decreasing and zapping you of your energy, things like that. Now, with substance use, what you have is somebody using a psychoactive substance. It could be alcohol, it could be marijuana. And what we see is that most people who use addictive substances don't actually become addicted to them. An exception to that is if they actually start using that substance before the age of 14. And that's because the brain is still developing. It is easier to create habits. The reward to decision-making circuitry ratio is not fully developed yet. And it's also a time when they should be trying out different ways of coping, and they can end up relying exclusively or disproportionately on the substances to help them do that. And so really any early use you want to think of as a problem, but certainly if they are using more and more, if they're using it in dangerous situations, or they're drinking and driving, or they're with people who are drinking and driving, or starting to affect them emotionally, thinking about a substance use disorder. With PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder, you'll see this 8% lifetime, 3.5% 12-month prevalence, but things like nightmares, flashbacks, avoidance, irritability, numbness, edginess, trouble sleeping. But the thing that I want to point out about post-traumatic stress disorder with youth is that because of the power differentials, they are always in with adults. There are often things they have experienced that the adults around them may not be aware of. Certainly people like teachers who see them a lot, but may not have a window into their home life. And so, as you can see, the symptoms of PTSD are really, except for the nightmares and flashbacks, things that you could confuse with the child just being angry, or just being oppositional, or just being anxious. And there's a high trauma loading for kids in this country. And so it's always important to keep in mind that this could be something that's at play that people aren't aware of, haven't diagnosed, don't know to take into account, because the very nature of the disorder is that it requires someone who's had usually an adult hurt them, trust a new adult with that information, and sometimes that information may not come out right away. So what do we do about this? How do we think about this? So Edward Deming said a bad system will beat a good person every time. And so as we think about our own personal responsibility and how we want to help promote the health of the youth in our own lives, but also thinking about a more healthy population, there are things that we can do as individuals, right? But some of what we have to do as individuals must relate to actually trying to address some of these systemic drivers of the disproportionate exposure of youth to adverse experiences. But you can't pour from an empty cup, right? And so I think for anybody who is grappling with these issues, who's working with youth, you want to know when you need to seek professional help or when it may be good for them to do so. So if you're starting to have situations where people's function is falling off, or they're withdrawing from loved ones, where things that were interesting to them are no longer interesting to them. Sometimes with youth, it may be that they stop progressing, right? So they feel stuck and they're not developing at the rate that they were before. And always, if there are thoughts of suicidality, or there's reckless behavior that could result in them being harmed, that could result in other people being harmed. Substance use, again, those are areas where you want to take that and get some professional help on board as well. A lot of times with mental health, mental illness, we talk about what's wrong. We talk about things that we want to avoid, right? But there are things that we know if you make this a part of someone's developmental experience, it is a positive childhood experience. So it's a protective factor for them. So when it comes to trying to address youth mental health, stepping away from this model of what's the problem we're going to fix and stepping forward to a mentality of how do I give them as much to work with? How do I give them as many positive childhood experiences as possible? So these are things like participating in community traditions, feeling a sense of belonging in high school, feeling supported by friends, having at least 2 non-parent adults who take genuine interest in them, feeling able to talk to their family about their feelings, seeing their family as a source of support, feeling like their family looked out for each other and stood by each other during difficult times, feeling safe and protected by an adult in their home, and having someone to take them to the doctor if needed. And so we all have power, right? When I start talking about youth poverty and Medicaid rates and all of those things, right? Sometimes people start to feel overwhelmed, right? And we're on Zoom, so I can't see you. But sometimes the problem can seem so big. But I would challenge you to think of the areas where you have power, and this is also borrowed from the World Health Organization, because you all have somewhere that you can leverage to address some aspect of this issue. And because it is so cross-cutting, because it goes across so many different systems, there is something that all of us can do. So power over is to influence others, power with, the collective power of communities or organizations, power to change existing hierarchies, and power within, to have individual capacity to exercise power. A really simple example of the power to, right? I'm here talking about youth mental health. I'm an adult who's far from youth, right? I wanted to do something to bring the youth voice into this, and that's why we use those videos. For those of you who are making decisions about youth, what would it look like to have a youth advisory council or to make sure that their voice is at the table as well? Just one example. And mental health interventions are so much more than medications, right? And then for youth who are in minoritized racial groups, a positive racial identity has also been proven to be protective. And so making sure that if they are in an environment where they're hearing a lot of negative things about what it means to be in a minoritized racial group, that they are given materials, opportunities, historical perspective that gives them a different way to see themselves and their place in the world. And so I have a question for you, which is how can every child realize their own potential, work productively and fruitfully, and make a contribution to their community? And that's that definition of mental health we talked about earlier. In a society that fails to assure equal access to liberties, rights, and opportunities, and chooses not to care for its youth. And that is borrowed from that definition of social justice. And I would argue that in order to have a healthier society, we also must have a more just one. And if you are interacting with children, advocates of children, invested in children, justice is part of our work too. And with that, I will stop my slides and open it up for comments and questions.
Thank you, Dr. Vinson. That video of the children was heart-wrenching. It really was. And, you've really given us so much to think about here, how to look beyond what you see in front of you and not try to label, but just understand more. We just can't possibly know what is going on, what that child comes with. And we know this, we've heard this over and over. Kids don't care how much you know until they know you care as a teacher. And as a parent, these same stressors that you talked about, of course, are affecting their adults. And so it's so difficult, but what great reminders. So give me some basics. The words the kids were saying: lack of respect, lack of being heard, lack of being validated, not valuing what they bring. Tell us some specific communication things that we can do as adults when we talk to children.
Yeah, so I travel a lot and I see people with their kids, right? And people complain about kids being on their phones, but the adults are on their phones just as much.
Absolutely.
And so truly being present as a unit is something that sounds simple, but really does matter, right? And when you're thinking about risk for mental health issues, it's hard to know if there's a change if you don't have a good sense of the baseline. And so it's not just about listening or talking when you're concerned, it's about listening or talking all the time so that you have that goodwill in the bank, you have that rapport established, but then you also can notice, right? My kid's really into anime, they don't care about it anymore. That's an issue, right? But if you didn't know they were in anime, you wouldn't know that was a change, right? And so it sounds simple, but really being present. And I know that is so much easier said than done. But it's one of the things that I actually notice across socioeconomic status for different reasons, right? And so that's something I think is really important. The other thing I'll say too is a lot of times it is hard to see people you care about hurting or struggling. And so it's hard to listen just to listen. You want to listen to respond and to problem solve and to give solutions. And sometimes people just want to be heard. But that can be hard for parents and for people. Still hard for my parents to do for me sometimes, honestly. But sometimes that can be really important too. And sometimes kids may not have the language that you may like them to use, but they may be telling you something is off in different ways, right? So it could be that performance is going down, or they're telling you they're bored, or things like that. And so understanding that communication isn't always about them sitting down and articulating their deepest, darkest secrets in words, but they may be showing you. And that could be a red flag that, you just got to spend some more time with them.
And Dr. Shan's got a question, but I'm going to ask one more before I turn it over to him first question. In your practice, what's happening today?
So families are stressed, right? The country is stressed. There's a degree to which people are almost on two extremes, right? They're like, I can't take it. They have blinders on and they're like, I'm just going to go about my day to day. And there are people who are, doom scrolling. And I think it is, it's at least in this country having this level of polarization, but also this level of like mass communication as it's all going on in real time is just something we're trying to figure out how to deal with. I'll say a lot of families are scared, right? If they have people of different immigration status, the fear that those families feel is real. If you have families who are dependent on Medicaid, either for the caregivers of children, that is a huge stressor. When you have people of different immigration status who are the primary caregiver for children, right, who are now having to worry about what if I get taken away? Who is going to be responsible for my child? Do I need to get a power of attorney in case something happens to me? Right? Like these are things people are having to think about now. And sometimes children are the proverbial canary in the coal mine, right? They may be acting out at school because the family unit is stressed and you just see that. But yeah, that's some of what we are seeing. The other thing that we saw during another recent period where people in power were normalizing othering and kind of like overtly bullying racist behaviors, right? Is that you saw that happen more at the child level as well, right? That modeling, that modeling and really the endorsement in some ways of those kinds of behaviors resulted in that happening more. So that is something I haven't seen yet, but that I'm definitely on the lookout for in terms of that being a stressor for kids.
Yep, we're hearing that. Dr. Shannon, I'm going to turn over to you for your question.
Okay, I have one question. Number one is, can you just name me the number one thing that we need to do in answering this question? How do we develop healthy coping skills to deal with life on life's terms, especially in the African American community, where you see racism as a normal way of life, as you see poverty sometimes as a normal way of life. And we live in a grief culture. I don't know if you're familiar with Chicago, but it's sort of somewhat like Atlanta, where sometimes we have 30 to 40 deaths over a weekend. And also we have life disappointments. So how do you deal with, navigate healthy coping skills when you are living in that type of environment?
Yeah, and there's a degree to which, right? And I'll answer your question, but I will say that the fact that people are in environments where that is their reality is a commentary on our larger society, right?
Right.
I always feel that it's important to pair any discussion about resilience with a discussion about protection and provision, because it is indefensible that in a society with our resources, that there are children who are exposed to those kinds of things, because it doesn't have to be the case. Now that I've said that, there are some things that have been shown to be protective, and even when it comes to children who have a high trauma burden, those protective childhood experiences matter for them too. So having the adult, having people outside of their family they're connected to, feeling connected in terms of their high school and that sort of thing, having a sense of purpose is all important. For Black youth in particular, it is really important that they have something to kind of map their identity onto that is broader than what they're being told about who they are or what they can be or the path that they're on. My parents were very intentional about teaching me Black history from elementary school on. They didn't expect the school to do it. They knew they weren't going to, right? But there's a way that helped ground me. And I think that sometimes we overlook how important that is, because as you are trying to figure out who you are in a society that tells you what you can't do, what you can't be, in all these different ways, it's really critical to have something else to hold on to and to work toward. And so that's one thing. And then the other thing is, and this is something that is that's going to happen community to community, and that really has to be led by local people. But it comes down to, what can we do to help our children feel safer? Because at the end of the day, if you don't feel safe, your body is going to be wired to pay attention to the things that make you feel unsafe. And that is something that helps us all survive, because if you're dead, none of the rest of it matters, right? And so sometimes I think we want to put kids in therapy and put them on meds and do all these other things, when it's like, they can't be in the house with the stepfather who raped them.
Right.
Right. And so, like, really practically, concretely, what can be done to help that child feel more safe and more secure? But it's a big, complicated question, and it's not the same answer for everybody, but those are some of the basic things.
Thank you.
There's a question here about neurodivergent children. How can we help them with the daily stressors you just described?
Yeah, so one of the things that about neurodivergent children is you met one, right? Sometimes, so there's no blanket thing, but I will say that issue of knowing baseline matters for them too, maybe even more so, right? And so sometimes I think people, and I see this in the clinic, I teach residents and young doctors, sometimes they get these families and these histories that are super complicated, right? And you forget to do the simple stuff because of all the complicated stuff, right? Yes, they may have a diagnosis of ADHD or autism or learning issues or language, right? But being attentive to that child and them knowing you are invested in them and you care about them, that still matters. And so that's one thing that I think would apply across the board. Now, when it comes to the systems that are supposed to be serving these children, and again, this is something that is not going to be accessible in an equitable manner. But one of the things that we always try to do to the degree that we can is make sure that they have testing that shows where the differences are. And that testing is then in turn used to inform what their school environment looks like. Because school is a place where you don't only learn, reading, writing, and arithmetic, but it's a place where a lot of socialization happens. And if you end up out of school for some reason, whether that's suspension, expulsion, what that means for your long-term trajectory, whether that is occupational opportunities or even your risk of criminal justice system involvement, is really significant, right? So if you know that there are some differences, you want to make sure that the school environment, to the degree possible, is aware of them and accounting for them, both cognitively, but also like socially and emotionally. And so that can be really hard to do. Again, easier said than done. But understanding that people having that information, accounting for that, and really, in some cases, it takes a lot of work on the caregiver's part to hold those systems accountable for providing those things. And I wish I had an easier answer for you, but it does.
We're hearing a lot about the lack of joy in our young people these days, the disengagement, and then you're trying to find some relief in marijuana or alcohol. What do you want to tell? How can we? What do parents need to know to have that conversation with their kids?
Well, first thing I'll say is, kids do as you do, not as you say. So if they're seeing you use alcohol, seeing you use marijuana, you're not going to be a very credible messenger to them about not using it. Now, we know their brains are different. It is a different risk for them. We all know that cognitively, right? But a child is seeing you use it and do it. It's going to be around the home. It's going to be more accessible. It's going to be more likely that they do. So that's where I'll start. The other thing I'll say is that sometimes we are very quick to tell people what they shouldn't do without understanding why they do it, right? So if I'm using marijuana because it helps me go to sleep, or I have nightmares if I don't use it, I don't have an appetite if I don't use it, then unless you give me something else to help me with my nightmares, my sleep, and my appetite, I'm going to keep using it. So rather than saying you shouldn't be using marijuana, what does it help you with? What are you using it for? Because then you can give them an alternative. Because if you just say don't do it, right, odds are they're not going to stop that behavior. And that applies broadly to any behavior like you don't want a child doing. Redirection is always going to be more effective than just telling them to stop.
That's great. When it comes to suicide, we know that having that conversation does not put that idea in someone's head. Can you just reiterate that, if you don't mind?
Absolutely. So by having the conversation, you are signaling to them, this is fair game to talk about. I want to hear about it. It's not too much for me to handle. Your life matters to me, right? And we have reams and reams of data that absolutely show what you just said, that talking about it does not introduce the idea. Talking about it signals that you're an adult they can trust with what they may be thinking. So by all means, if you have concerns, bring it up, talk to them about it. And maybe, right, you're not the auntie or the cousin with the best rapport with the child. Maybe it's not you, but maybe it's somebody else in the family that you say, hey, I'm worried about Timmy. Take him to a basketball game. Y'all have a talk on the way there. Right.
This is our last question. If you had an opportunity to have a microphone to reach out to every parent, every adult in the United States and beyond, what do you want them to know about hearing children, being present, having them feel seen? What would you say to them?
Make the time for it. Nobody feels like they have it. Nobody. Make the time for it.
It's important. It's worth it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Vinson. What an honor to host you. And already, I can't wait to have you back again. So this is when we go hug the kids. So we're going to go do that. We're going to go hug the kids.
Absolutely.
Thank you, doctor. Thank you, everyone. See you next time.